So you want to be a pastor, or maybe you already are a pastor, and you're trying to figure out what exactly you need to do. What's your job? What's your responsibility? Most of the time when we step into ministry, there are a million things that we're responsible for. And most everybody's looking to us to say, hey, what are you going to do about this? And for us, if we are either just starting out, or maybe we've been in ministry for a long time, we still haven't figured out quite what we're focusing on. It can be overwhelming. And quite honestly, for most of us who struggle with burnout or struggle with anxiety and depression, that's what it comes down to, is the questions of what are you going to do about this? What are you going to focus on? And we don't really have a good answer for that. And so what I want to do today is I want to talk about what exactly is your job. You're the pastor. It's your responsibility, whether you're lead pastor, you're the youth pastor, whether you're the worship pastor, discipleship pastor, whatever pastoral role you step into. The question is, where are you going to focus your time and your energy and your intentions? And that's what we're going to talk about in this episode. So the big question is this: how do pastors like us, who remain focused on the mission of Jesus and serving our communities without being distracted by everything in the world around us, how do we increase our effectiveness while living a lifestyle that doesn't compromise our health, our families, or our personal relationships with Jesus? That's the question this podcast is going to answer. I'm Dr. Brandon Party Cooper, and welcome to the Ministry Hackers Podcast. Welcome. I'm so glad that you're here with me today on this episode of the Ministry Hackers Podcast. I hope you're doing well wherever you are, whatever it is you're doing, whether it's morning, evening, in the afternoon, maybe it's late at night and you're staying up and you're just listening in on the podcast. Thank you so much for being here. One thing that I know about you as a pastor is that your time is very valuable, and the fact that you want to spend some of it with me is very appreciated, because my goal is to help you be more effective as a pastor, as a ministry leader, and to do what you can to fulfill the calling God has placed on your life, as well as the calling that God has placed on everybody's life in your sphere of influence. Hey, we are in October, and we are in planning season. So if you're not already there, you're not already thinking about 2024, you should be, because it's right around the corner. We are on the cusp of all the holidays and everything that goes on, and it's going to go very quickly from now until the end of the year. And before you know it, it's going to be January 1, and you're going to be looking to go back into the office on January 2, and you're going to be looking at what are we doing this next year. And that's not the time to plan. Now is the time to plan. Every year I take time in September and October, and I plan out what the calendar is going to look like for next year and what the budget is going to look like for next year. If those two things are set and ready to go before January 1, then you are way ahead of the game. And so what I want to do is I want to offer you the opportunity to get a free budget template that you can use to start planning for 2024. And what this template is going to do is it is already set up. It will work in your Excel sheets, in numbers. If you use Google Sheets, it'll work in there. All the formulas are in place. All you have to do is choose your categories. You can put your current budget categories in place and just plug in numbers. It will do all the calculations for you. It'll formulate it. And so you don't have to do anything other than just tell the sheet exactly what your budget numbers are. And that will help you see exactly how much is coming in for next year, or at least what you project to come in. But most importantly, it's going to help you understand, where is your money going? How are you going to use it strategically to make ministry impact in your community, to take care of your staff if you have any of those, to make sure your ministries are running well, and to make sure that you're not going through 2024 asking the question, where are we going to pay our bills? How are we going to pay our employees? How are we going to cover all the things that we've committed to? How are we going to support the missionaries and the different ministries that we've committed to? How are we going to do that? All those questions go away because you've already planned it out. And so I want to invite you, go to brandonpartycooper.com/budget, and right there you will find you'll be able to download the budget template, start plugging in your numbers, and you'll start looking ahead to 2024 with a plan, knowing exactly what it is that you're wanting to do, exactly what it is that you're able to do, and it will help you lower your stress and focus your attention for next year. So again, brandonpartycooper.com/budget, get your template, start using it, and plan out your 2024 right now. It's October and it's happening. And so you need to get ahead of that. You need to start thinking ahead. And a lot of that's because, again, as pastors, there are a lot of things that we have to focus on. And I know for me, in the roles that I've been, so I've been an executive pastor, I've been a youth pastor, I've been everything except for a lead pastor. And most of my time and attention is focused on making sure that everything is running smoothly, making sure that people are resourced, making sure that our discipleship program is running, making sure that our leadership development is working, making sure that all of our staff members have the budget numbers they need, the resources they need, making sure their volunteers are operating in the ways that they need to. And so there are a lot of things that our attention can get to. And by planning out our budget and our calendars, it helps me, at least in my experience, it helps me to not be creating and thinking and reacting. It's helping me to execute the plan that God has already put in place. And so what I want to talk about today is, where should we be focusing our attention? Where should we be looking to put our time and energies toward? Because if you're like most pastors, you would like to have more time with your family. You would like to have time for a hobby. Maybe you would like to travel more and see the world and go visit family in other countries, or in other places of the nation. Most of us, most of us who are in ministry, we've moved away from family. I know for me, when I was 20 years old, I moved away to Bible college, and I have not lived any closer than 2.5 hours from my family since then. And so being able to travel to family is a huge thing. And with ministry, it's very hard to set aside time to do that. And so what is it that you're wanting in your personal life, and maybe even in your home? You're wanting more time with your kids. You have young kids and you're wanting to spend more time. How do you navigate all the demands of ministry and still make sure you have time for that? And so what I first want to do is, I want to say that as a pastor and as a ministry leader, what you are not called to do. And I say that with a little bit of hesitancy, because maybe you have a calling to do this, but I think most of us, we have a calling into ministry, and it's not this, but we think it is, because it's kind of what we've been told in a very subtle way. But we are not called to grow or build churches. That's not what we're called to do. I know I'm not called to do that. I got a very clear calling when I was in high school. I was called to go into ministry. I interpreted that as called into youth ministry. I wanted to be this great youth pastor for my entire life. I was going to be Josh McDowell was one of my examples. I wanted to be Josh McDowell in my 50s and 60s, and still speaking to youth, and still, being a youth pastor. That was my plan. God's calling, though, and I realized this when I got to college, Bible college, was that God's calling on my life was to equip and train pastors, which is why I do what I do today, which is why I have this podcast, which is why I do the consulting work that I do, which is why I've gotten the degrees in leadership that I have, because God called me to equip and to pray for and to be alongside pastors just like you. And so think about when you were called. Were you called to grow a church? Was that the calling that God put on your life? Now, I'm not saying were you called to plant churches, because some of us have that. Some of us have this apostolic calling to go and plant churches, get them set, get them in place, and then move on and plant another church. Some of us have that. But planting churches and growing a church are not the same thing. At least I don't think they are. But I think that in very subtle ways, most of us have been lulled into this idea that our job is about growing churches. Now we couch it in this kind of overtone of like that we're trying to grow people, but really when we think about our meetings and we think about the conversations we have and think about things we do day in and day out, most of that is about building churches, getting more people to come to our church so that they will stay and be in our services, and so that our church will grow. And we translate that as more people in my church means more people getting saved, which means more people, reaching out to other people and evangelizing and bringing more people. But it's always about more people, more people, more people. And that's what growing a church looks like. And the reason that I don't think that we are called to grow churches, I have three primary reasons why I don't think that that's quite what we're called to do. And the first one is because when we focus on growing churches, then what we really focus on is we focus too much on the business side of ministry. Now, I will be the first to tell you that a church is a business. It's an organization. There's a business side to it. We as pastors, regardless of what level of ministry you're in, you have responsibilities to the institutional element of the church and to every government structure that plays into that. So, for instance, we have to pay taxes. That's not optional. We have to follow certain laws and guidelines. If you're a youth pastor and you find out that, somebody or if one of your kids comes to you and says, hey, I'm having some issues at home, or hey, I spent the night at my cousin's house last weekend, and there was something that inappropriate happened. Well, as a pastor, our job, as a youth pastor, your job is to report that to the authorities immediately. That is a business element of what it means to be a church. So, again, churches are organizations, and so there are organization business elements that come into play with that. However, when we focus on growing churches, we get too locked up in the business side. We get too locked up in the numbers. What are our budgets? What are our, how many salvations do we have? How many baptisms do we have? How many people are coming, newcomers, are coming into our church week after week? And how many of those are we retaining? And how much are we worried about the back door, people leaving? How much are we worried about the tenure of each pastor that's been on staff? Are we keeping our pastors more than 3 years or 5 years? Are we locked in on our growth groups or our small groups or whatever it is we call them? Do we have enough of those? We get caught up in all the business side of things, the numbers and the bottom lines. We get locked into that. And again, I'm 100% like we need to pay attention to those. But the mission that we've been called to, what you and I have been called to as pastors, that is more a calling to go and change this world with the gospel. And if our focus day in and day out is the business side of things, then we lose sight of what it means to share the gospel and to disciple believers into a stronger relationship with Jesus. And so that's the first thing. If we're focused on building churches, we get too focused on the business side of things. The second thing is we fixate on the numbers. We fixate on bottom line budgets. We fixate on how many guests are coming in. We get locked into these numbers. And for some of us, I'm probably lean this way a little bit. I get into numbers. I get into a budget spreadsheet, and I like processing through all those. I love getting into statistics and running a survey and seeing, what everybody's saying about whatever else. I love getting into some of that stuff and mining out information. But if we're so focused on numbers, then we forget that every number is a person, and every person is going through something. They're going through hurts and pains and challenges and difficulties, and they're celebrating things and they're mourning things. And when we're locked into the numbers, we forget the faces and the hearts behind it. And we lose sight of what God has really called us to focus on, and that's the people that are represented in those numbers. And we forget to value people at the level that we should as pastors and ministry leaders. We should be valuing people at the highest level. And I've been around ministry long enough, and I'm sure you have too, where you have seen pastors and ministry leaders not value people, not value what they have to offer, not value their opinions, not value their hurts and pains and struggles. I've seen that, and I'm sure you have too. And we get too locked into the numbers, and that's what we end up doing. We lose sight of the people that are behind those numbers. And then the third thing, and maybe one of the biggest things, is that when we focus too much on growing churches or building churches, we burn our volunteers out. Now, most churches are upside down in their volunteerism, which means that they need more volunteers than they actually have. And most volunteers know this. Most volunteers know that when you're making a plea for volunteers, hey, our kids ministry is so great. It's wonderful. We love it. Kids are awesome. They're the future of our church. And we need you to be a part of volunteering in our kids' ministry to make sure that our kids are growing. When we do that, most of the time it's because we have a need. The church has a need. We don't have enough volunteers in the kids area, so we're making a plea for people to be involved. That's upside down volunteerism. Because every volunteer that, whether they respond or not, every volunteer in that room knows you need me more than I need you. And that's backwards. And then what happens is when we're so focused on growing churches, we just burn through our volunteers. We ask them to do way more than they committed to do. We ask them to put in way more time, way more energy. We ask them to do things that they never said they even wanted to do. We just expect them to do that. And then on the worst case scenarios, we then guilt them into volunteering their time, volunteering their energy, or even in some ways, volunteering or giving their finances that maybe they don't have. Not because God has called them to give, not because God is wanting to bless them, though He is, but we are using them in the pursuit of growing or building a church rather than growing people. And then we burn them out. And I'm sure you've seen it. You have volunteers that, they've been faithful and they've done what they could do. They were great at what they did. And then out of nowhere, they just come and they say, you know what? I'm going to step off. I'm going to take a break. I'm going to stop doing this. And we give them the space. We say, okay, that's fine. I know you've been committed for the last 5 years and, you just want to break. Great. But the reality is most of the time, those people don't come back. Now, they will likely or hopefully stay in your church and continue to attend, but they may never step onto any other team after that because they're burned out. They came to church to be with their family, to find a community, and to come into a relationship with God. And what we did in our pursuit to build a church, what we did is we took them, we said, hey, the best way to grow in your relationship with Jesus is to volunteer in this area. And they were excited and they were hopeful and they were looking for opportunity. And then we used them week after week after week after week. And then when they couldn't, we gave them a hard time or we guilted them or we said, yeah, that's fine, but then we'll need you twice over the next couple weeks or whatever the case is. And over time, there's grace and they're patient and they're like, okay, yeah, sure, Pastor, I'll do it for you. Yeah, Pastor, I'm there for you. I'll be there. I'll do it. But then eventually I can't do this anymore. I don't want to do this anymore. And we burn them out. And that's the last place we want to be. Volunteers are not a means to an end to build a church. If we're burning our volunteers out, then we are focused on the wrong things. So, what should we be focused on? Again, if you're not yet in ministry, some of this is you may not be able to connect with this, but for those of us who have been in ministry for any length of time, you're going to know that this is the reality, that we burn our volunteers out sometimes, or we get too focused on the numbers, we get too focused on the business side, we get locked into the nuts and bolts of the organization rather than the heart that God has called us to pursue. And so what should we be doing instead of building churches? We should be building people. If we're clear, the church is people. The church is not the building that we meet in. And we know this. You know this. I know this. This isn't rocket science. None of us are being shocked and awed by this moment. But sometimes I think we forget this. In our day-to-day ministry and our day-to-day responsibilities and everything that we're doing, we forget this. That the church is the people that God has saved, He has called, He has empowered, and He has sent out. The local church, the building that you and I work in, or the organization that you and I are a part of, that is simply a training ground. It's a place to take care of people, to love people, to bring them closer to Jesus, to disciple them so that they can go be the church in their everyday lives. That's the point of the local church. And so our focus should not be on building churches, because building churches is not what God has called us to do. I don't think. When I look at the Great Commission, I don't see anything there about the church, churches, the local body. I don't see anything about that. What I do see in the Great Commission is a call to people, loving, discipling people. And so what happens when we focus on building people? What happens when our attention is on building people rather than building churches? Well, the first thing that happens is that our focus is not about getting people into services so that we have a bigger service, we have a bigger church. The focus is then on growing people. How are you discipling people? Now, any of us that have been in ministry during COVID, who've come in to COVID, come through COVID, and come out of COVID, one of the things that became abundantly clear, painfully clear for us, is that there are a lot of long-term veteran Christians who have not been discipled well, who have not been grown well, who do not know their Bible, and who are not really even very familiar with God, simply because we have not done our part in discipling into a healthy relationship with Jesus. When we focus on building people, when our attention is there on building people, then our focus then is on growing those people. How are we discipling? How are we going beyond the Sunday morning sermon? If all you're doing is offering a sermon on Sundays, then you are not discipling. And what I would argue from my end, what I would say is, if you're offering a random hodgepodge of classes and small groups and things like that, and you don't have a strategic step-by-step process for somebody to grow in their relationship with Jesus, then you are not discipling them at the level that you could be. You know, one of the things that I've done over the last several years in the last 3 churches that I'm in a part of, one of my primary roles has been building a pipeline of discipleship and leadership, helping people from the moment they walk in the door go all the way through, if they want to, all the way through to being in full-time ministry. Because people don't just grow randomly. If people grow randomly, then their relationship with Jesus, their discipleship, it's random. And when we look for if we want to jump back onto the business side, if we want to jump back onto, I want to grow churches. Well, if you want to grow churches, then you need people who give on a regular basis. You need people who attend on a regular basis. You need people who will step up and volunteer, be a small group leader, be in the kids area, be on the worship team. You need people who are disciplined. You need people who are consistent, that you can rely on, trust in, that are loyal to the calling, loyal to whatever commitments they make. That's what you need, right? If you're building churches, that's what you need. But the problem is if we're only preaching to them on a Sunday morning and then giving them a random hodgepodge grab bag of classes and small groups and, Saturday conferences, if that's what we're giving them, then they're growing in a haphazard way, and they're not developing the disciplines, the commitments, the loyalties, all of those things that a step-by-step strategic discipleship process will teach them. If we focus on growing people, if we focus on building them, then they get deeper in their relationship with Jesus, they're closer to him, and they develop the spiritual disciplines that we look for in a healthy, growing local church body. So if our attention is on building people, then we focus on growing them and developing them. The second thing is that we fixate on relationships. We don't fixate on numbers, we fixate on relationships. Now here's kind of the tricky underlying part of that. Is in ministry, we talk a lot about relationships. We have small groups for relationships, and we have discipleship classes for relationships. And come to our Sunday morning service where you can connect with people and be a part of our service and grow in your relationships in our community. That's what we say. But the rhetoric that we use a lot of times is more focused on just getting them there, getting them in the room so they can connect with people. The question is are we, you, pastor, me, pastor, are we focused on building relationships ourselves? Are we just focused on providing opportunities for people to build relationships, or are we building relationships? Are you going out and meeting new people? Are you going out and connecting? If somebody comes in the doors, and this is really hard for me, I am super shy. And so when somebody comes into our doors at church on a Sunday morning, there is this internal struggle that I have because for whatever reason, in my head, they don't want to talk to me. I'm nobody. They don't want to meet me. And so I will just fade away into the shadows and let somebody else meet them who's more outgoing, more friendly, more likable than me. And I have to force myself to go up and meet them, introduce myself, say hi, welcome them, not because I don't want to, not because I don't want to meet them, but because I'm shy and I have my own insecurities. But when we focus and fixate on relationships, I know that the next person that walks in the room or walks through the doors, I know that if I go up and meet them, maybe I will have a relationship, maybe not. Maybe I'll meet them and I'll connect them with somebody else and they'll find their people in our church and I'll just become just a person they met that first time they came. Or I will meet them and they could be somebody very significant in my life, or I could be somebody very significant in their life, all because I took the time to connect with them and build a relationship with them. And that's the difference, is that as pastors and ministry leaders, when we're focused on building churches, then we're focused on connecting people with other people so I don't have to. Hi, so nice to meet you. So glad you're here. Let me connect you with this person so I can hand you off and I can go meet the next person and I can hand them off and then meet the next person and hand them off. And by the end of the day, I've handed everybody off and I don't have to worry about it. I'm helping you connect and have a relationship with other people, but I don't really want to focus on building a relationship with you because I have a church to run and I have a ministry to operate and I have numbers to focus on and I need to make sure everything works. And that's hard for some of them. For me, that's hard because I want to make sure everything runs well. And I have to remember that I need to connect with people and build relationships. The third thing, if we're focusing on building people rather than building churches, is that we focus on equipping our volunteers. Again, I think this is one of the biggest problems we run into across the board. Doesn't matter what church you're in, where you're at. One of the things that we enjoy at our church, and it's not because of me, because I walked into it, it already existed. The gentleman who oversaw it before me did an outstanding job, and I'm just trying to do my best to keep up with what precedent he set. But our church, we have a 60 to 70% volunteer rate, which means that 60 or 70%, between 60 and 70% of our people who come into our church and call our church their home, 60 to 70% of them volunteer on a regular basis. Now that is astronomical. Most churches are lucky to enjoy a 20 to 30% volunteer involvement. And again, it's not something I've built or created. It's something that was there when I got there, and I'm just trying to build off of it and keep it going. But it's because we focus on building our volunteers. We focus on connecting them relationally. We focus on investing in their growth and development because we're not looking to build volunteers, church volunteers. That's not our goal. Our goal is to equip our people to live lives that change other people's lives. We don't want great church volunteers. We want great expressions of God's creation attending our church, which means that we help our people grow in all kinds of things way beyond just knowing how to do a volunteer job. Sure, we give them the skills, we give them the abilities, we give them whatever it is that they need in order to fulfill the job responsibility they have as a volunteer. Yes, we do all of those things. But what we also do is we help them with their time management. We help them with their goal setting. We help them with understanding what their spiritual gifts are, understanding what their personality profiles are. We help them understand those things so they can be better parents, better spouses, better coworkers, better employees. We want our people to be impactful in our community. And it starts with us investing in them. I want our volunteers to get more value from us as pastors than we get from them as volunteers. That's my goal. That's the intention that I aim at. That they get more from us than we get from them. And we get a lot from them because they are an incredible team of volunteers who give their time and their attention. They focus on details that we miss sometimes. They do an amazing job. And so it's on me, it's on us as a pastoral team to make sure we are giving them more than we're receiving from them. But isn't that what we're called to do? As pastors, isn't that the goal? That we give more than we take in? And I think sometimes because of the loads we carry, because of the overwhelm, because of the exhaustion, because of the anxiety and the depression that we deal with. Sometimes we're okay with taking more than we're giving out. And we would never say that, and it's probably very subconscious on our part. But we're okay with that because we're tired and we're exhausted. But one thing that I've learned years and years ago, the more I invest in other people, the more I invest in volunteers, the more I resource them, the more I love them, the more I build a relationship with them, the more I help them believe in themselves and look forward to the calling that God has placed on their lives. The more I do that, the less I have to do. Because I have great people who carry the load with me, and in some instances carry the load for me, not because I asked, but because they want to, because I've invested so much in them that they are willing to do it. And they don't do it as if they're carrying a burden. They do it in great style, with great energy, and sometimes more effective and more efficient than I would do it. And that's the goal. Because as a pastor, there are a certain number of things that only you can do. And getting to the point where you're doing only those things, and you have good quality volunteers who happily step in and do all the other things, it's spreading the blessing around. It's keeping stress levels and anxiety levels down. And it's helping you and me as a pastor run this race with long-term endurance. This is a marathon. If you're starting out in ministry, you're a new pastor, or you've just started in ministry over the last 5 years, this is a marathon. I've been in ministry almost 25 years. And I'll tell you, there are definite times that it is exhausting and wearing out. And there have been a couple points along the way that I asked, God, maybe I should step out of this and do something else. Not because I wanted to, but because it exacted so much from me that I wasn't sure that it was sustainable. And what I've learned is if I focus on the things that only I can do, equip others to do the things that they are really good at doing, and then love them and build a relationship with them and equip them and support them, then we all win. The kingdom of God advances, communities are reached, and lives are changed. And that's the goal. It's not to build churches. It's to build people who carry the gospel to every nook and cranny of their lives so other people's lives are changed. That's where our focus is. That's our goal. That's what we should be spending our day-to-day operations doing. How do I equip my people? How do I grow people? How can I pray for the needs that they're in? How do I pray for the struggles that they're having? How do I stand in the gap for them to help them get through whatever difficulties that they have or reach whatever goals that God has placed in their hearts and their lives? How do I give myself in such a way that people grow and lives are changed? And that's my challenge for you today. Focus on growing people, not growing your church. Because if you grow people, your church will grow. That's just the way it works. You focus on growing your church, it might grow, but it's going to be at the expense of a lot of people along the way. And there's going to be a wake of people behind you who got hurt, who got burned out, who got used, who got lost, and many of them who don't even serve Jesus anymore. And that's not what we want. So that's my challenge for you. That's my encouragement to you, because quite honestly, growing people is way more fulfilling than growing churches. It's way more fulfilling. It's so much more exhilarating to see the light bulb go off in somebody's life. And they're like, oh my goodness, I never saw it that way. Or, oh my gosh, I can't believe God's doing that. That's what we want to see. That's why we stepped into ministry. I'm guessing that's why you stepped into ministry, because you wanted to see people's lives changed, not because you wanted to fill an auditorium with X amount of people so you could say, we filled that auditorium with X amount of people. Isn't that awesome? No. Anybody can draw a crowd. But it's only those of us who focus on really letting God move in us and through us to change lives. Only a handful of us in this world can really grasp that and understand that. And what we want to do is we want to instill that into every member of our congregation if we can, and help them pastor the people in their lives and influence the people in their lives to be in relationship with Jesus. That's the goal. Grow people, not churches. All right. I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for being here, for joining me, and I'll see you in the next episode.